So hello, and welcome to another of my series of conversations. My name is John Cornicello, and I'm usually here on Mondays and Thursdays at 10 Pacific Time. My guests today are Kim Weston and Zach Weston. Kim is the grandson of Edward Weston and grew up working with his dad Cole and his uncle Brett. I get those right, correct? I got the
Yes,
right
you got
order?
it
Yeah,
right.
good. And Zach is Kim's son, is also following in the photo footsteps. And we're joining them today at Wildcat Hill, their home in Carmel, California. So let me introduce to you Kim and Zach Weston.
Howdy.
Hi, Mike.
Let's see.
See, Martin has his cup of coffee.
Oh, yes, always coming.
Good to see you, buddy.
Yeah, I take it, some of the people in the room here, and
Yeah.
if people have questions, just throw them into the chat or speak up. Um, but I'm going to ask both of you, like, what has it been like to grow up as a Weston? When did you realize who you were or what part your family was doing?
That's an interesting question. You know, when you grow up, let's say with a maker of shoes, you really don't think about shoes. I really didn't think about my grandfather. It's photography was just something we did, and I
Hmm.
thought everyone did. In fact, I was always quite shocked if I went over to someone's house if they didn't have a darkroom. But yeah, I mean, I of course started when I was 6, and just something I fell into, something I enjoyed, uh, working with my dad in the darkroom.
Hmm.
Yeah, there wasn't much talk about how great my grandfather was. Um, I sort of learned that much later when I
Hmm.
got older. And when I got a chance to work with my dad on Edward Weston's negatives. So that sort of opened my eyes because he died when I was 5. Um, it sort of opened my eyes to who the man was. So it
Yeah.
gave me sort of a personal connection with him, uh, working through his images with my father.
And then you worked also with Brett.
Yes, yeah, I worked with Brett probably last 20 years of his life.
Uh-huh. So you did printing for him or general
Not
assisting or?
assisting, yeah. He was interesting. He always did the printing, where he would make the exposure, put the paper in the developer. But after that, I did everything. I fixed it, I washed him, I spotted him. But he was very insistent on making the actual control of the print by himself, even when he was up into his 80s.
Wow, wow. Do you have some favorite memories of working with him?
Yes, yeah, quite a very, very interesting gentleman. In fact, I always said I was probably the only assistant that didn't wear a skirt.
Yeah, I guess, or before you, I guess there was a reputation in.
Yes, even when I was working with him, quite the ladies' man.
But you actually married one of your models.
Yes, yes, I did. Sort of similar in some aspects. It's interesting living here at Wildcat, where my grandfather lived and where he lived with Karis, which was
Hmm.
his model, who he eventually married. So the similarities are very interesting.
Yeah, so Zach, how was it for you growing up Weston? I mean, you're still pretty young, but
Yeah, it's pretty much the same. I mean, it wasn't really talked about or anything
uh-huh.
like that. I mean, I just sort of grew up in it. Yeah, I didn't start doing photography until I was in college, so when I was about 22.
Yeah, because I met you a number of years ago, and it didn't seem like you were doing much with the business, but now you're really into working on the workshops and
Yeah, definitely
handling
more
everything.
into it now, and like growing up, when we always had friends over that were showing work and having, like, I guess,
Hmm.
artist gathering parties, and it always just seemed like it was, just it's
Yeah, so
did it.
what is it about the Carmel Monterey area that has all these art photographers in there? And you have any thoughts on that?
Maybe it's just the beauty that surrounds us
Uh-huh.
here, and definitely from Ansel Adams and Edward Weston, sort of that inspiration from them is definitely trickled around the art community here.
Yeah, Kim, you have thoughts on that too?
Yeah, it's interesting. There's still quite a art community here. I
Hmm.
mean, Carmel has obviously changed a lot, but it's mainly known for its tourism. Uh, but there is still an underlying very large community of artists, not just photographers, painters, sculptors, poets. And I think that's is always been the sort of trend in this area.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
So you have a scholarship program going too, the Weston Scholarship. Can you tell us about that?
Yeah, so my parents started the Weston Collective back in 2004 because they saw dark rooms and photography classes being defunded, and so they wanted to create sort of like an incentive program for teachers and students, which is a scholarship competition. So students would submit a portfolio of 10 images that were all processed in the darkroom, and they would be judged, selected, and the winners would get one of their images in a show, and they would receive a cash scholarship. And so that's been going on since 2004. We've given over $100,000 and like 350 scholarships,
Nice.
which is a super cool thing. And we're continuing to do it. We even did it this year with the pandemic. You know, even when we couldn't meet, we tailored it to an online deal. But you know, we're hoping next year to get back at the in-person.
Yeah, that's
Right.
great. I mean, we still have the Photo Center Northwest up here in Seattle that does dark rooms and teaching programs. A couple of people in the room right now are part of PCNW. I mean, one of these days we should get you up here to do a lecture or something.
Yeah, I
I've
love it.
been trying to get Kim up to visit Seattle for a while.
I know.
Good.
So,
Well,
are-
the collective also moved in, Zach and I moved it over because mainly it was run out of here, but we have a new building over in Seaside at the Martin Luther Jr. College for the Arts, or School for the Arts,
mhm.
where they gave us a very, very large classroom. Zach and I went and built a dark room, built a developing room. So it really sort of opened up our space for students to come. We have not only traditional black and white, but we also have digital
Mhm.
printing capacity there. So
Yeah, are either of you shooting any digital or are you all still film?
Mostly y'all film.
yeah,
Yeah,
there's nothing wrong with digital.
yeah,
Digital's
no,
great. It's just a tool.
yeah,
You know, when
yeah.
you've been doing photography for as long as I have, it's all about just making it as simple as possible.
Hmm.
And I know my film, I know my camera, so I really don't have to worry about that. It's not important. You know, I
Is
want to create. So
Are you still primarily RB?
yeah, yeah.
Or the RB67, for those who
RB.
don't know.
Yeah, the older I get, the smaller my cameras get.
That was sort of me too, because we were talking before. I started it in a catalog studio shooting 11 by 14 Deerdorfs
Right,
in
right.
1979, and I've been working my way down in size since then.
Yeah. Brett did the same thing. Of course, he had 11 by 14, 8 by 10.
Hmm.
The older he got, excuse me, the older he got, the smaller the cameras got. And just, you know, just the moving the camera and all that. It just made
Yeah,
it.
yeah, much easier.
Yeah.
A couple of years ago, you started painting on your photos. Are you still doing that?
Still doing that. I love it. It was one of those sort of exercises that I've always loved painting. A lot of my photographs are inspired by painters. So I just decided to do something that I knew I could possibly fail at. Painting. I was never trained as a painter, but painting on a photograph, I don't have to build it up. The image is already there.
Hmm.
So basically, to me, it's just another layer to that story. A lot of my imagery is very story driven. So it's just another way of expression. It's another page to that drama.
Yeah, it seems like you built a lot of sets for your photos over the years.
Yes, yes. Worked in the studio basically for 30 years.
Hmm.
But now, not so much. I mean, we teach our workshop. We have one session in the studio, but we do a lot of traveling workshops. So Zach and I are going out to Wyoming this next month. We've gone to Spain, Germany,
Hmm.
France. So the opportunity for building sets is less and less. And it was just sort of, you know, you go through phases.
But
You
you
know?
you did carpentry work too, though, so that probably helped you there.
Yes, I was a carpenter for 30 years.
Wow, wow.
I had to pay the bills. Can't do it on photography alone. At least I can't.
Yeah, I understand that. I understand that. I took a hiatus and worked for Adobe for 20 years, and
Right,
you
right.
know, now I'm
Yeah,
back to photography. But this pandemic thing has pretty
yeah,
much killed any commercial work.
yeah.
So I think I'm considering myself retired from the commercial world, and now I'm just going to shoot for myself.
Oh, that's great. That's good.
Yeah. What about alternative processes? Are you still doing platinum, palladium, and the like?
Yeah, I had a student come over the other day. We did platinum, and nowadays with the technology and stuff, we were able to make digital negatives through the computer and print them out on the Epson
Mm-hmm.
um, through a process that we have. So it really opens up that large. Normally would be stuck to large format because platinum printing is a contact process. But this way, you could shoot anything. You can shoot digital, film. You just need to capture an image, and then we make negatives in 8x10 or 5x7, and
Nice.
then contact them in the darkroom.
So for you, has photography been a product or a process?
It's a process,
I mean,
and
that's what I.
it's a never-ending process, uh, and I'm always learning something.
Hmm.
It's really sort of more of a self-driven journey to find out. I know what my passion is, but to refine it and understand it, I don't know if I'll ever get there, but I'm working at it.
Yeah, so you have a lot of your work has been figure lately, nudes and the like, but I think you also talk about more composition and negative space and things like that. So what are your thoughts on subject matter
Yeah,
versus is a photo the the object that you're photographing, or is it an art piece itself?
it's a culmination of things. I look at shooting the figure as no different than shooting the landscape.
Hmm.
It's a building of a rectangle, um, and making that rectangle pleasing. So it doesn't matter if it's a human body or if it's a landscape. It's a way to compose that rectangle. So those sort of disciplines travel throughout whatever you shoot, at least for me. You
So pictorialist or F64?
know. No, I'm a storyteller.
Yeah.
um, it's funny the F64 group. It only lasted for a couple of years.
Hmm.
But that was in sort of rebellion to the East Coast photography, which they were trying to make photography look more like painting. And so this West Coast idea was just to shoot straight photography,
Hmm.
no manipulation, anything like that. Um, so it was basically just a way of just letting the camera do the job instead of trying to manipulate the camera to make it more like an art piece of some
Hmm.
sort.
Great, great. So you have a story about Edward and Brett maybe going out shooting together and Brett framing something up.
Oh, well, there was a story that everyone thought that Edward was the first Weston to come to Point Lobos, and it really wasn't. Brett was the first Weston,
Hmm.
and this happened when Edward was up in San Francisco visiting Ansel Adams, and someone had told Brett that he had to go to this place called Point Lobos. Of course, it wasn't a park then, and he went there and just fell in love with the place, photographing it, and developed and printed the work. And Edward had a little studio in Carmel where he had Edward's work up. What Brett did was he took all the Edward's work down and put all his brand new Point Lobos works up. And Edward and Brett had a very, very loving relationship. And so when Edward came back from San Francisco, he wasn't mad or pissed off. He said, you know, Brett, where is this place? You have to take me there. And of course, the rest is history. It's, you know, Point Lobos is known as Edward's sort of place. And of course, he was buried there. Also, his ashes were scattered.
So the story I was thinking of, though, was one of them framing up a photo, and Edward.
Oh, that was with Dad.
Oh, that was with
Dad.
Cole.
And they were out on the North Shore of Point Lobos. Back those days, there were no restrictions. You could go anywhere. And my dad had set up his 8x10 camera and was photographing at this wall of trees and rocks. And Edward was right close to him working with his own camera. And so my dad goes to his dad, says, Edward, or Dad, you know, can you take a look at this? I see something here, but it's just not right. So Edward went under the dark cloth and looked at it for a second, took the camera from a horizontal and made it into a vertical, asked for a film holder, and put it in the camera and took the photograph. And now that is considered, it's one of Edward's photographs. But he didn't move the camera, didn't do anything except make it from a horizontal to a vertical. And if I had the image, I could show it to you. It's really pretty interesting. But what he did is he brought a round rock in the bottom of the image into play. Mm-hmm. So yeah, I always told Dad that, you know, that's really half your photograph. You know, all he did was make it a vertical. Yeah, it's pretty funny.
Yeah. So who has Edward's negatives these days?
All the negatives at the Center of Creative Photography in Tucson. Mm-hmm. There's only one negative that is allowed to be printed, and my dad gave it to me. And that's called Spring, and it's a photograph of a nude of Karis through the window in our house.
Yes, I have one of those prints here. Very nice.
Yeah.
Very nice. So folks in the audience, do you have questions you want to bring up? I mean, I'm just been hogging this.
Well, I just found that I have this. I had met at...
You got muted somehow, Ian.
Sorry, Sammy and Kim and I had met at the Sammy's photo event in LA in 2017 when a mutual friend of ours, Milan, who goes by Milan Von Braun, dragged me over and said, "You have to meet Kim Weston."
I remember that.
Kim told me that if I didn't buy his book, he couldn't afford to have lunch, so I bought it.
Yeah, that's great. That's a great little book.
So, Michael, are you there? You had some... Michael's actually met... Did you meet Karis, Michael?
Yes, years ago, probably in the late 70s. Mm-hmm. She came to the Midwest. One of my students just took the initiative to hunt her down and call her and do a paper on her. I was teaching at the time and working full-time at May Company in St. Louis, and she came and did a lecture at the behest of this student. Pretty good extra credit, I'd say. And it's just very interesting, you know. She was just really a wonderful, delightful, you know, person, very, very engaging from what I remember. So it's quite some time ago.
Yeah, for those who don't know, Karis was Edward's wife for a while there, and she has a book out called Through Another Lens, is it?
Yeah.
Through a Different Lens?
Yeah, Through Another Lens.
Through Another Lens.
It's a great book, and Karis used to come down to Wildcat, and of course she used to live here, so it was really fun to have her in the house. Super, super sharp memory and brain, and it was always a treat to have her here because she'd always tell stories about, you know, little things in the house that we didn't know about. And so, yeah, she was a wonderful person.
I do have a question, and maybe if everyone here knows the answer except for me,
okay.
Since I was in the commercial business for the last, 20, 30 years, although I was still shooting creative work on my own. As I know, Edward shot, a lot with 4x5 also, and they were contact printed. And a lot of the images I've seen were actually dry mounted on really inexpensive mat board, if you might call it mat board. It looked like Hanes t-shirt Matt, Matt, but has anybody, or did he ever enlarge any of his 4x5 work? Put it in an enlarger, or was everything contact printed with a light bulb?
Yeah, everything was contact printed. And the only time I think he might have enlarged, I know my Uncle Brett built him an enlarger out of an 8x10. Because what he did was some of his Mexico work of Diego Rivera, Roscoe, that group of people were all done on a 2.5 by 3.5 Graflex camera. And they were fine, but they're little images, smaller than a 4x5. And what he did, because he loved the size of the 8x10, he actually made duplicate negatives in 8x10 size using that enlarger. And it's when I was working with my dad with the negatives, you could see those ones that he did because they had interesting corners on them and stuff. They were actually probably, back then I didn't know if they had duplicating film. He probably shot it onto a piece of film, got a positive, and then took the positive, put it on another piece of film and made a negative out of it. But that's the only time I know that he ever used an enlarger, was to actually enlarge the negatives in the 8x10.
So, but Edward, I mean, Cole, your dad never enlarged any of his work from
No.
4x5s now. One last question. I know that late in his life, he did a series of images with Kodachrome. Is that correct? 8x10 Kodachrome?
Yes.
At behest of Kodak. Have all those images been published, or did he only shoot about a dozen?
Yeah, I think they made a catalog of some of that color work, but not to my knowledge did they make a lot of prints. It's interesting because he really liked color, and of course it was towards the end of his life, and some of the images what you'd see was he would go back, excuse me, he'd go back to the exact place that he had done a black and white photograph. And I remember one in particular, which is a tree trunk in Point Lobos, which they call the Flaming Root. He went back and did an exact copy of it, but with color film. It was really kind of interesting to see, you know, how he was playing with color.
Have you worked with color?
Only in painting.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. But no.
My voice changed there for a second. I don't know what that was.
Thank you very much.
You're welcome.
I don't want to belabor the technical side of things, but I'm just curious. Did you ever consider going digital, or did you try any digital?
Yeah, I mean, we had a bunch of little digital cameras and stuff, but I don't really like the computer. And so, and I thought about it. It's a great tool. I mean, it's so versatile. But I figured that it would take me at least 10 years of working with it to get to the efficiency I have with my camera today, my film camera. And I didn't want to take the time, you know. It was, and I didn't want to sit in front of the computer. There again, my process, I try and keep it as simple as possible. And, you know, knowing your film, knowing your camera, knowing light is all I need. But yeah, the digital is an incredible machine. It really opens up the world to a lot of different things.
What are your favorite films?
I use the T-Max 400 now. I was using the Ilford FP4, but I was finding that after developing it, it had a kind of a haze on the back of it. And my friend Ryuji, is a photographer around here, had the same problem. It didn't seem to affect the print, but I decided to switch Ryuji's to try the T-Max 400. I used it years ago. It's an interesting film. It's super sharp. And also because I'm, you know, basically shooting figures and indoors, I need a little bit faster film. and it sort of fits that bill really well. I love it.
So I take
I
it you're a
do that.
tripod user?
Oh yeah, yeah. I tried, you know, the RB67 has a pistol grip for it, but you know, maybe my son could do it because he works out a lot. But no, I shoot it on a tripod. I have the big 6.7 Pentax, which I can hand hold. So it's great. It's the same format, but it gives me a little bit more flexibility. So I have that as my backup camera.
Nice. So let's talk a bit about workshops. How long have you been doing workshops at Wildcat Hill?
Oh my God. Huh?
2001.
I think 2001 we started here.
Nice.
And I did workshops before with my father. So I've been around the workshop. You know, that's where we met. A lot of our friends was working with my dad. But yeah, since 2001, we do the Wildcat workshop. Yeah, it's great. I mean, we have such a wonderful location. It's Edward's house, you know. So historically, it has a big significance. And we do all figure work. So it's great. It's, you know, we do a 3-day workshop, a Friday meet and greet, Saturday and Sunday shoot.
And you cook dinner for...
And I do dinner.
Very well.
Yeah.
Yes, yes.
And I've been doing a lot of one-on-one tutorials, which really have really been picking up. And that's where I take a student and we work together with a model. I've done it also as landscapes. But so we go through the whole process, photographing the model, developing the film if they're film, if they're digital. That's another great thing about digital is it's relatively easy to critique. So yeah, the tutorials work out really well.
So do you have any openings in this year's workshops coming up, or are they all sold out?
We put them all on hold. I think we're sold out in September. We're doing 2 here. Wyoming, we're sold out. Even a week or so. But yeah, the ones in September, and then of course the pandemic things,
Sure.
you know, threw everything around. but yeah, we'll start up in September.
How was the pandemic for you there? I mean, you're pretty isolated already.
Yeah, I'm a shelter-in-place guy. That didn't really affect me, you know. Yeah, we live in a very isolated area. So yeah, it's pretty standard for me to be at home anyway.
Can I ask, I'm always amazed at the work that comes out of a person's mind. It's like, what recess and what corner of your mind does that come out of? What's your thought process or creative process, or how do your shoots start and come to be, especially those with your models and the landscapes or even on locations?
Yeah, like I said, I'm very inspired by painters. And in fact, all my reference books are all painters. I have very little photography books. What that does is the paintings are like story-driven images for me. And they really put me in a place where I can start. I have certain painters that I go back to again and again. So I'm always working on solving the problem, solving this issue that I have. And that's what I love about at least the type of work that I do. It's not just taking a photograph and then you're done with it. I'm constantly going back to old ideas and reworking them again and again, trying to figure out the problem and how I'm going to deal with it, how I'm going to solve it in my own mind. So it's very, like my dad always said, "Oh, Kim, you're too cerebral." You know? And that's just the way I work. And so I have this sort of bag of imagery in my head that I can always go back to. So it's this never ending sort of learning curve for me what am I trying to say in this photograph? What is important to me? As well as building the image, as we talked about before, the composition of the image and what stays in, what stays out. And also photographing with a model, it's an inner reaction. It's with someone else. It's not like if you go out and do a landscape. The inner reaction there is very limited to what you see, but when you're shooting with another human being, it's another human being with emotions, with feelings. And that's what I love. It's a conversation. I'm not just photographing the model. We're actually making artwork together. And so in this type of process that I do, if I have a painting that I'm really interested in, I'll email an image to the model and we will work on it together. So it's a collaboration between the two of us, which to me is the most important thing in the work that I do, is that relationship. And that's why the models that I use over and over again, because we're working on this thing together as a team. It's not just photographing a figure. So that enriches the whole process for me and the model. That's what, for me, making art is. It's not just recording something.
I think that brings back to the question I asked before, of photography, a process or a product. It's the process of working with people and creating the image. That we get an image in the end is great, but for me, the exciting part is actually having the person there and the collaboration. And
absolutely, the photograph is just a record of that experience, and in that way, that, like you said, the photograph is almost secondary. It's just a recording of an emotion between two people, and working together on something. When we went to Europe, we actually took our models with us because I didn't want to get into Spain where we did our workshop and not have a model that I didn't know, that we weren't comfortable together. And photographing naked women, it's a revealing thing, and so that trust between the two of you is super, super important.
Mentioning the nudes, did you ever do self-portraits?
I've done a ton of self-portraits, and in the nude, and no one's ever going to see it. My wife, I made a portfolio for my wife and gave it to her, I don't know, on Valentine's Day. I think it's very, very important to get in front of the camera yourself. And when I first started doing it, many years ago, it was quite revealing. And I really wanted to understand what it was like to have a camera being pointed at you while you were naked. And so I still do that today. I think the self-portrait is a very, very important tool and aspect of the photography process.
Yeah, I mean, during the pandemic thing, was my most used subject.
Yeah.
Either that or flowers. I used to say I'm going out for a walk to steal the soul of flowers.
Right. Yeah, and it's funny, this new book that I'm doing, there's a whole section on self-portraits. So I've gotten up, it's almost done. It's 450 pages.
Wow.
Yeah, it's quite a thing.
Do you have a publisher, or are you publishing yourself?
I can publish it myself.
Nice.
And I'm just have to find a printer. I always wanted to do a photography book, and I was sort of tired of the run-of-the-mill photography book where it's just a photograph after photograph after photograph. So this is basically my life story. So it starts, when I'm very young, my relationship with my mother, of course, my dad, my uncle, and how my life as a photographer has progressed up to this day. So there's a lot of writing in it, and Zach will attest to that because he's my editor. So yeah, it's almost done, and I have a designer here. It's just incredible. It's going to be a beautiful book. It comes with one of my prints and the spring print of my grandfather's in a special case. It's the book and print set. I'm going to do 200 of them, and yeah, I'm very excited about it.
Nice, nice. For those who joined us late, Zach has an ear infection. That's why he's not participating as much as Kim there, but we're glad to have him in there and hope he feels better soon.
Yeah.
Can I get an advanced order in for that book, Kim?
Yeah, absolutely. No, it's quite the project.
Can I ask a little bit more about your process during the day of a shoot? You go out to a location with a model with sketches or written ideas? Do you put the model in a specific place that you've looked at before and shoot one or two and then move on? Or what is your process?
Yeah, I usually sketch out, especially if I'm doing my own personal work, and even on a workshop, like when we're going over to Wyoming, before I go, I'll have sketches because I've been to the place before. I'll have sketches of locations and what I want in that scene. And it's also really helpful for the model to be able to look at the sketch. It's a starting point. It's not necessarily where you're going to go exactly, but at least it gets you started on a thought process. More and more nowadays, I don't just go out and shoot. I usually have a collaboration with a model. I have a model up in the Bay Area that wanted to work on her issues with religion and how she was raised. So we went back and forth. She was showing me paintings that she wanted to get the feeling of that painting in the work that we're going to do together. I ended up building a big, huge set in my studio of a church. It was one of those projects that almost you just left it alone and not done anything because there was so much work involved in putting the set together. But when she came down, there again, that collaboration is so important. We were working together to create something and to work on some of her issues about religion. Yeah, it's very hard for me just to go out and shoot anymore. I have to have an idea. The model either has to come to me and just like with this model, and we work together on something. I don't know, just I'm getting older or what. The work has to be really meaningful to me to do it. And part of the reason why I do the painted stuff is I can go back and revisit old images and add new life to them. And yeah, I don't just go out and photograph. Zach and I have been going out and doing some landscapes together, which is really fun. I enjoy that. But my real sort of passion is that working with another person.
I think I saw some photos recently that you're cleaning up or redoing your studio.
Yeah.
It looked a little different.
Yeah, it's very civilized now.
Can't wait to see it.
Yeah, Zach and I rebuilt a whole wall of cabinets, and yeah, it's almost too fancy for me. Yeah.
So go ahead.
Random was good.
Pardon?
No, I was just saying the randomness of the studio was really quite an attraction.
I know. That's kind of gone. Everything's in its place now, But,
So you'll never be able to find anything again because it's in
right.
its place.
Exactly. Oh, it's still got a lot of fun stuff in it and lots of props and stuff. So, yeah.
Great, and that's with the great skylight.
Yeah.
And even in Edward's house, you have a skylight there. So you're all natural light photography.
Yeah. I don't use lights. Once in a while, we'll use a reflector,
Mm-hmm.
but that's about it.
Yeah, that's why one of the things I love about coming down there, because I'm almost total studio up here in Seattle. So whenever I get down to Wildcat Hill, it's okay, sunlight and outdoors.
Exactly.
I'm usually afraid of going outside.
Yes. Even when you're in the studio, you're slave to the light outside.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, a couple other people have joined in, so if you have questions, feel free to unmute.
Have you found yourself going back through older work and finding new gems that you did not see before?
Sometimes, yeah, because I get so excited, when I do a shoot, I'll go and develop, and I'll go in and I'll cherry pick. I don't make that many contact sheets, and I'll cherry pick the negatives that I like, and then I sort of forget about the other ones. So every once in a while, I'll go back and because you get so excited about the images you already made prints of. I'll try that, but not a lot that happens. I'm pretty good at reading negatives. But yeah, every once in a while you go back, and of course you see things differently. Your feelings change, it's a different sort of perspective that you have.
Do you do any special effects work in the darkroom, double exposures, things like that?
No,
or mixed media?
no, it's so funny. I'm such a traditionalist because I was trained by my father and my uncle, and mainly my father. And what it was is I'd be working in the darkroom with him on EW negatives. And so it was a very precise set of structures in the darkroom. Because at the time, we'd go in there and we'd make 40 pepper 30s in a morning. So every one of them had to be exactly the same. And I was trained that way. I can go in and do 40 prints and have them all exactly the same. So it's a very regimented style of work. And, that's just, to me, that sets you free. Once you have those controls, then you can be much more creative. It's no different than a painter. Most great abstract painters knew how to paint other things than abstracts. What that does is give you the tools to have freedom that you wouldn't normally have if you were just hit and miss. So it's very hard for me to manipulate. I dodge and burn. And I'll tell you a little story. I went up to print with my friend Roman Lawrence, and he said, "Come on, I have this big project I need to help print." I said, "Great, He's one of my best friends, but I never worked in the darkroom with him before, and I was all excited, And of course, he doesn't get up until 10. I'm up at 6 in the morning. Oh, we're gonna print. No, you gotta have your coffee and all that first. So anyway, we get in the darkroom, and of course, he's 6'4", and so the sink came up to about my chin, and so I had this little stool that I scooted along the darkroom floor so I could reach into the sink. So he's doing the exposure at the enlarger. He gives me the print to put in the developer. So I put it in and I go, "Roman, where's your clock?" I always develop for 3 minutes, and that never changes. He goes, "What do you mean clock? I don't need no clock. I just look at it. When it's good, it's good." And you're crazy. You're crazy. Here you are, you're judging a print in safe light conditions, And I said, "How do you do this?" He said, "Well, look, it's done." Take it out. And after a while, I could do it. Your eyes adjust, and you can see what the finished print's going to look like. I've done a lot of darkroom work, but it just blew me away because growing up under this very strict regiment type of darkroom work, to have this sort of, just throw it in there and pull it out when you think it's good. Of course, he gets into a lot of problems that way because every print, which I kind of like, every print is slightly different. And he's very successful, and people would look at his books and then like an image and say, "Okay, I want to buy that image." So Roman would print it, but it may not look like that image in the book, and he's constantly getting in trouble. It just doesn't look like the book, but it made me at least think a little bit more freedom in the darkroom. I still use the clock. I still develop for 3 minutes. Anything that I do, I want to be able to have control is in the enlarger, not in the chemistry part of it.
So being your 2 1/4, you're using an actual enlarger and then dodging and burning underneath, as opposed to the contact print with the tools above.
Yeah, contact print is much harder to dodge and burn, at least for me. And
seems like it sort of becomes a dance. Like if you want to repeat the same print, you got to learn your movements and your timing and.
Exactly. That's why I try not to do a lot of dodging and burning, because, and that's another thing about digital that I sort of turned me off was once you get it all programmed, once you push the print button, every print's exactly the same. And I like, I do change, not so much in a printing session, but over time, I will see an image differently. And depending on my mood and what I'm feeling like, I'll print it differently. And I think that's just a natural process. It's just, however you're feeling at that moment can change how you see that print.
Jim, you had a question in the chat. You want to ask that?
Yeah, I had to skip out and take a phone call, so I missed part of the conversation. But this has been really good. Thank you. It's really interesting to hear all of this. But I have friends who are painters and photographers, and that they make photographs differently than those of us who are just photographers. And so I'm curious, now that you are painting on your photography, has it changed how you see when you make photographs?
No, it's interesting. In the very beginning, I just took random prints that I had and started painting on. I never went out, I only did it once, with the concept in my mind, I'm going to paint this image that I photographed. I did that once and it worked. I mean, it worked out because there was a certain thing that I wanted to be able to paint. And so that discipline worked for me. But normally I just go out to photograph. And if the photograph can work as a painting, it works. If it doesn't, it doesn't. So to answer your question, very rarely do I go out and change my vision to make it a paintable photograph.
And you don't feel that your voice has changed because of painting? Because it seems like someone with a painting background looks at light a bit differently, looks at shape a bit differently than people who don't have that painting background do.
Yeah. I mean, my whole photography creative process is all about light. That's all it is. Yeah. And so what the painting enables me to do is add a different layer of light to a photograph. If I want a shadow to be blue, I will paint it blue. So it's to me, it's just another tool to sort of change the perspective of that image. If it's an image shot in the daytime, I want to make it nighttime, I can do that. So there's a ton of things I can do painting-wise that I can't do photography-wise. And that's, I think, one of the reasons why I enjoy doing it. It's just another challenge for me. And in the beginning, why I did it was, I'm a good photographer. I've been photographing most of my life. I was not a painter. And what it enabled me was a chance of failure. I think without that sort of chance of failure in a project that you're doing, success is unattainable. So at least for me, you can remember the first time you did a photograph and the sort of the fear of, oh, is it good? Or will people like, all this sort of angst that comes up,
Well, especially back in film days, because I'm shooting digital now. When I was shooting film, is like, you shoot it and then you won't, and then I sucked at darkroom stuff. And as a kid, when I was 12, I won't see that print until it got developed like next week, who knows when.
Right.
So it was like, shoot it again. Okay, one more time, just make sure.
Yeah, it's interesting. That's a curse and a blessing of a digital camera. What I find is people with digital cameras that have never done analog shoot way too much.
Yeah.
it's a discipline that they haven't learned.
Mm-hmm.
You know, like you just said, if you're shooting film, you know that you have to go in the darkroom, you have to develop that thing, you have to wait till it dries, you have to make a print. So there's this long process that you get before you get satisfaction.
Yeah.
With digital, it's right there. It's instant. And that can be a good thing and it can be a bad thing.
Yeah, I'm the same way coming from the film world. A lot of times I'll get back from something I shot digitally, and there's fewer images than I thought I shot. You know, I could have sworn I took 10 of that, but there's only 3 there. Okay, you know, because I'm self-editing at the time.
Yeah.
And Gerardo's asking, he's digital and he's did very little darkroom work. So what is dodging and burning? How's the best way to describe that?
Dodging and burning is basically, you know, you're projecting your work down onto an easel with a piece of photographic paper. Well, if you have a dodging tool, which is a solid object, usually a circle, if you interrupt the light flow down to that print while you're making your exposure, where you're taking less light, it's going to become lighter. So a lot of times you normally do that in a shadow area. You want a little more detail coming in. And just the opposite with burning, where you expose the paper to more light. I use a big board and I sort of bend it around, and you know, you want the sky to be darker, then you expose it more light, but not putting light on the part of the print that you don't want light to. So it's a little process.
Thanks.
Yeah.
Well, we're coming up close to the top of the hour, so does anyone else have questions they're dying to ask here? Here's your chance.
I want my spaghetti recipe. I know Martin does.
Yes.
Yeah, which do you get more pleasure out of these days, cooking or photography?
To me, it's the same. You know,
It's another process.
I'm not just a photographer when I pick up my camera. I try and live my whole life that way. So it's either gardening or cooking or taking a walk with my wife or doing something with my son. That's my life. And I'm a photographer at all times. So if it's cooking, cooking is very similar to photography. It's a calculation of different flavors and colors and textures, no different than building a photograph. And so yeah, I even in my garden, you know, it's the same thing. I always look at it through a photographer's sort of sense.
So does that mean there's going to be some recipes in this book of yours?
You're absolutely right. Yes, there are recipes.
Great.
Yeah, there's recipes and all kinds of interesting stuff.
Do you take photos of your food?
No. I mean, the fact that the title of the book is Growing Up Weston and Who Ate Pepper 30? Because Pepper 30 was, you know, one of my grandfather's iconic images. And there's always, and the book has a lot of these little stories in it. Story that my uncle and my dad would always argue who ate Pepper 30, because of course they ate all of Edward's models. Well, still life.
Yeah.
And so someone did. Pepper 30 got cut up and eaten in a salad, you know, which if you think about it, it's pretty amazing that one of the most iconic images ever that they sat around and ate afterwards.
Yeah, it's ephemeral.
Yes,
Janet's asking over in the chat, you don't seem like a person who's easily intimidated, but I'm wondering if you could speak to what it was like having a great-grandfather and a great-father photographers.
No, I'm not easily intimidated. There again, you know, my work was so personal. You know, I love my grandfather's work, my dad's work, my uncle's work. But the work that I do is very selfish. It's very much for me and my growth as an artist. So, you know, being compared to my grandfather never really hurt me. In fact, we had a show up in San Francisco where it was my grandfather's work, my dad's work, my uncle's work, and my work. And it was many, many years ago. And the review came out the next day, and of course they're glowing things about my grandfather's work, great things about my uncle and my dad, and then a little line at the bottom said, Kim Weston should not be shown in the same building as Edward Weston. So you get used to things like that. If you let them bother you, you wouldn't, I wouldn't be doing what I'm doing.
Yeah, reviews are always interesting.
Yeah.
Well, I'm
But
glad that you're still doing what you're doing. That's pretty harsh.
Yeah.
I mean, it's one of the things I like is going to photo exhibits with photographers because we all have so many different opinions. I mean, I remember I was in a critique group, and my background is anthropology. There was one photograph that showed people and art, and it was this sort of up in Seattle. There's this outdoor sculpture park, and so I made this photograph of this road that goes underneath it, and these people here and this art. And for me, the anthropology of it was really cool about our relationship with art and various things. My art major friends were like, boring, too much concrete. I'm like, but it's people. And they're like,
Right.
So reviewers, fine. They have their own view, but we all have our own view of what is meaningful to us.
Oh, absolutely. There are people that do critiques of other people's work, and I've always tried to be very, very positive. I know some people that critique in workshops just tear you a new one,
Yeah.
That's not positive, so I like critiquing. I like looking at people's work. I like discussing it with them, why they did this, why this, but I'm always very, very positive about it,
Well, it's one thing if there's a technical problem or their lights could be a bit more sophisticated. I mean, it's one of the things that, like, working with John Cornicello is that his lighting is always just amazing. His stuff comes out of the camera and it's always wonderful, which is challenging for those of us who don't have that magical ability. But it's a question of, did you have a vision? Were you able to make that vision and communicate something about that? That's it. Now you've made this experience. Maybe I get it, maybe I don't. But
yeah, no, hard. Absolutely. And the whole thing is, I mean, who am I to say what their brain is thinking when they take that picture? I can be supportive technically, like you said. If it's not printed well, there's nice ways of suggesting that they print a little bit differently. But who am I to say that? I mean, what they're seeing, it's such a personal view, So it's interesting. I've done a lot of critiques of people's work here, and not trying to change their vision, just trying to give them an extra, thing in their tool belt. I don't want them to go out and photograph me, make sats and do all that. If they want to, great, but not to imitate me, but to have some other perspective that they can work with.
well, when you've made this thing, being able to have someone else say, here's what I see, especially when it's someone with a lot of experience, with a lot of understanding of what the possibilities are, that's enormously great.
Yeah.
And that's something that is hugely valuable. Where I find it is when someone goes, oh, well, I would have done this differently. Well, that's cool. That's your thing.
Right.
Go make that photograph. Go do that painting. Go do that thing. Anyway, thank you for all this. This has been a lot of fun.
So
Okay.
Edwin had a question for Zach about shooting film and processing in digital. How do you feel about that? And Edwin, if you can clarify that.
Shooting and film and processing in digital. I
Yeah.
haven't done that much of that. The only really time I've done that is recently when I shot some color 4x5 and scanned it and printed it on our Canon printer at our collective.
Yeah, so you're usually normal process, shoot film, process in the darkroom, print in the darkroom.
Yeah.
Yeah, not hit the digital.
Yeah, I mean, I do a little bit of digital printing because we have such a cool printer over there, but it's mostly darkroom stuff.
Yeah. Are there other family members that pursue photography?
In our family?
Yeah.
My sister does, but that's about it. that I know of.
So I think one more question here from Edwin. Would you say that critique is an afterthought since we are not in the same conditions as the person who photographed the image?
What does that mean?
Yeah.
Pretty much what you were talking about. People.
Yeah, I'm not, I don't know, Edwin, if you want to clarify that.
I think you say
Otherwise,
pretty much like what they were saying before, is that each person's seeing something differently, so it's sort of hard to critique, you know, the subject,
subject matter.
of what somebody's
Mhm.
taking.
Yeah. Yeah, there's always something technical that they could possibly need help with, but
sure.
yeah.
Yeah, and it comes back to sometimes that, photograph should be the photograph, not what the photograph is of.
Right, absolutely.
Cool. Well, thank you. We're at 11 o'clock here. Does anyone else have final questions, comments, words?
I just want to say thank you, and I really enjoyed hearing about the creative process.
Great. It's great having all you guys here. It's fun.
Yeah, good to see you, and good to hear what you're up to, Kim.
Yeah. You too, buddy.
Cool. So next week on Monday, I'm going to have Dan Cooney on talking about collecting cameras from A to Z. Dan's the guy who bought my Deerdorf 5x7 recently. Judy Host is coming up in July, and I've got a couple others that'll be announced soon. So keep watching, and we'll see where we go from here. Anyway, thank you, Kim and Zach. This has been great. I think everyone really enjoyed this, and I'll let everyone know when a recording is available.
Great. Thank
Sounds
you.
great. Thank you.
Great to see you.
Thank you.